Hello, I'm Jocelyne Cesari. I'm a senior fellow at the Berkley Center. Welcome to the webinar on race, religion, and American nationalism. Before we get into the webinar, I wanted first to thank not only Georgetown University Berkley Center, but also the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting that has teamed with us for this event, and also the Luz Foundation for the generous support of this program. A few logistical information. The webinar is being recorded, and the caption video will be posted to the event page on the Berkley Center website soon. If you are registered for today's event, you will also receive an email with the caption video when it becomes available. In the last 15-20 minutes, we will answer questions from the audience. Please join the conversation by opening the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen and typing in your question. Having said that, let's turn to the core of this debate. As you know, it's mostly motivated by the ongoing events that have followed the January 6th riots. Christian symbols and messages were on full display during the January 6th insurrection. And the rioters saw themselves as patriots, restoring the US to its rightful state as a Christian nation, claiming that Trump is president and Christ is king. Most of the ways of looking at this particular and troublesome situation in the US has been to define this expression of faith and nation as Christian nationalism. But is it all of Christian nationalism? Is it really restituting the long and complex history of the relation between religion and nation in this country? Are there other ways of being Christian that can be reconciled with nation and national narratives? To debate these questions with us today, we have three panelists, and I will introduce them in the order they will speak. Jack Jenkins is a reporter for Religious News Service covering religion and politics. He previously served as a senior religious reporter for the Washington-based news website, Think Progress, and his work has been published or cited by many global news organizations. He is the author of American Prophets, The Religious Roots of Progressive Politics and the Ongoing Fight for the Soul of the Country. Terence L Johnson is an associate professor of religion and politics in the Department of Government. He's also a senior fellow at the Berkley Center and an affiliate member of the Department of African American Studies. And he serves on the executive committee of the Center for Jewish Civilization at Georgetown University. Johnson's research interests include African American political thought, ethics, American religions, and the role of religion in public life. Alejandra Molina is a national reporter at Religion News Service covering Latinos and religion on the West Coast of the United States. Previously, she worked as a reporter for the Southern California News Group, covering cities, immigration, race, and religion. In 2018, she was named one of the 15 most influential Latina journalists by Latino Journalists of California. So welcome to you, and I will give you the floor for 5 to 7 minutes in order to allow ample time for Q&A with the audience. So Jack, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you all again for having me into the Pulitzer Center and Berkeley. I think the topic of this discussion, I think, is you can go in a lot of different directions, and there's a lot going on. And obviously you mentioned January 6th as a key moment in which Christian nationalism was kind of seen expressed in a very public and prominent way. You know, for me, one of the ways I kind of see the different parts of the title of this talk kind of intersect was actually when I was reporting on January 6th. I wasn't down by the Capitol. I was down near this church, a Lutheran church in downtown DC. It was one of the only counter protests that day against the people who gathered in the Capitol, in our nation's capital, to express support for then President Trump, and then those who participated in the insurrection later that day. And that group was a group of multi-faith clergy who were standing around a Black Lives Matter sign. The subtext was that roughly a month before, there had been other slew of demonstrations by supporters of Trump in Washington, D.C., and some of those people, particularly Proud Boys, we have footage of them now where they had prayed before they did this and kind of appealed to Christ's crucifixion as, and them quote unquote sacrificing themselves for their country as one and the same. They were led in a prayer by where one of the Proud Boys, had them shout to the air that they love God. That they then, within 24 hours of that prayer, were running through the streets of DC and actually tore Black Lives Matter signs off of churches, at least two of which were historically Black churches, and in one case lit it on fire. So these clergy were standing there, around that Black Lives Matter sign and kind of a silent counter protest against the potential for that violence to occur again. And while they were there, people wearing Trump gear who were walking down to the ellipse burst into that gathering of clergy and mockingly reenacted the death of George Floyd. They then those individuals then went across the street, those people in Trump gear, and did the same thing again on the steps of another church that had just erected giant Black Lives Matter banners. And then, of course, what happened later that day were that insurrectionists participated in an attack on the Capitol that they repeatedly described as motivated by faith. We've had insurrectionists later describe their efforts as in one insurrectionist, when they broke into the Capitol, they appealed to Jesus, saying, that we do this in the name above all names. We had, of course, the Proud Boys pray before they participated in that insurrection. And of course, there was the video from New Yorker showcasing a prayer when people entered into the Capitol that day, into the Senate chamber in particular. And then I'll kind of close on this point, which is that what has happened since then is there's been a lot of conversation about Christian nationalism and what it means, what its contours could be expressed as. One of the first people into the Senate chamber that day was wearing a flag with the logo of America First, this kind of really right-wing, described as a white nationalist movement that is also very overtly Christian nationalist. Those members of that group often gather together and hold up crucifixes and chant, "Christ is King." And more recently, they gained a lot of attention because one of their gatherings, the head of that group, Nick Fuentes, had not only the group chanting "Christ is King," but then had them chanting Putin's name, Vladimir Putin's name, and applauding Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And then shortly thereafter, Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene walked on stage, and the first thing she did was discuss how she identifies as a Christian, and then the crowd chanted back at her, "Christ is King." And so, there's this interesting conversation happening, in including extremist circles, but not limited to extremist circles on the right, concerning, the Christian nationalism and how it can attach itself to any number of existing ideologies. And I should note that some of these extremist groups, and particularly the platforms that they use, there has been a notable uptick in conversations about Christian nationalism since January 6th. And there's open speculation as to whether or not that's because they see it as a powerful motivator for members of their group, or potential members of their group. They see Christian nationalism as something that can bring people into the fold, or at least get them more attention. So for my purposes as a reporter, I've been really kind of, with partnering with the Pulitzer Center, paying attention to these dynamics in the broader conservative community, but also particularly these more extremist groups that are getting, in many instances, louder or more attention than they would have gotten 5 or 6 years ago. So those are some things that I'm looking at in my reporting, and the overlap of race, religion, and nationalism is something that I think comes up a lot in these conversations.
Thank you. Terence.
Thank you, Jack, and thank you, Jocelyne, and to my panelists. I really want to frame what Jack just discussed in terms of sort of African-American political thought, and in particular, thinking it through the ways in which African-Americans have turned to Frantz Fanon to think about colonialism. And I'm reminded of a line from The Wretched of Earth when Fanon raises a question or makes a claim that those who govern are first and foremost outsiders, but they have to then convince those who are insiders that they are the outsiders. And so as Jack was sort of replaying and re-narrating January 6th, I just kept seeing this whole image, right, of people on stolen land, right, using rhetoric to claim it as theirs. And I thought, what if they're appealing to Christianity, appealing to this God in the context of, oh, we're actually on a land that is not ours? How would that, if at all, change their perception and change the reasons why they are storming the Capitol? And so what I think is interesting in terms of as African Americans enter this debate is that historically African Americans have appealed to religion, right, as a way to galvanize sort of faith reasons for why they should advocate for the abolishment of slavery, advocate for women's rights, advocate for voting rights. But when they enter the public sphere, they often use political reasons, right, to justify their claims for citizenship. And I think that's a really interesting and important point, because it speaks to the ways in which historically, particularly African-American Christians, have attempted to use their faith as a way to expand the very possibilities of democracy, to expand rights. And now we're at a moment where people are using religion in some ways to, in many respects, to narrow the very possibilities of what liberalism can offer. And I do think there's a strange tension, right, that speaks to the different ways in which African Americans have appealed to the Constitution, have appealed to the Bible, but also have appealed to their own experiences, right, as subjugated people, to think through not only the limits of liberalism, but the very possibility of what liberalism can offer, right, when we use our best tools to expand. And I think that's a point that we can't hear enough, this idea of when you're using religion to advocate for your morality, are you doing so to expand the very possibilities for the least off? Are you imagining how the neighbor will be included, right, within your model of salvation, within your model, right, of freedom? And I think those are sort of the rich contributions that African Americans sort of bring to the table. And also, as Jacques was talking, I'm also reminded that there are a number of people who are African American and Christians who have been very skeptical, right, of COVID and of all of the governmental sort of restrictions. And yet, even for people who are well aware of conspiracies, or well aware of government intrusion into their political lives, something happened. And I think because of January 6th, there's a stronger recognition that this was a different moment, right? That they too could appeal to the blood of Jesus, could also appeal to a certain kind of very Christian kind of nationalist rhetoric. But I think because of January 6th and because of the sort of blatant sort of racism and xenophobia, that they proceeded with caution. And I saw both ministers of working class congregations as well as more institutional churches really galvanized around this whole idea that, no, we actually need to get our folk vaccinated. And we also need to have a different kind of understanding of this moment in history as Christians. And so I think because of race, because of the history of enslavement and subjugation, they turned to Christianity in a very different way than we saw with many of our white Christian evangelicals. And I think that distinction is worth bearing note, because some people will say, oh, it's a distinction in terms of trying to otherwise these two groups. But I'll argue that, no, it's a distinction based on the democratic ways in which people are appealing to text, right, and trying to make sense of their own peculiar responsibilities or peculiar traditions in a way that's not attempting to obliterate other traditions. And I think that has been sort of the test of American democracies. Can we coexist in a way that allows for a religiously diverse population without controlling, subjugating, and eventually killing people. And often we have failed that test. But I want to use African American Christianity in particular, and African American political thought in general, as a kind of example, not necessarily to imitate, but as one way to kind of think through this problematic in terms of what rubric are we using to determine whether or not our moral claims are too expansive, right, and too intrusive. So I think I'll end there and let my other colleagues talk.
Thank you, Terence. Alejandra?
So what I'll talk about is at what point in my reporting I started hearing this term Christian nationalism more, and also when I started seeing people in public embodying this ideology. And if I have time, I'll talk a bit more about just how I've seen religious people, Christian people of all faiths, using their faith in a protest like Black Lives Matter and advocating for the vaccine, advocating for masking and for racial justice. But when I began seeing this term pop up more, it was obviously after January 6th. And I often think back to days before January 6th, when here in Los Angeles, the Christian musician Sean Feucht, as part of his Let Us Worship movement or tour, he had said that he was going to make a stop in LA, and more specifically in Skid Row, which is like a 56 block area in Los Angeles where unhoused people live, and many are Black and people of color. And so he was going to stop by here to do outreach. I'm not sure what kind of outreach because he never responded to our request, but he was going to be here. And mostly what we thought was going to happen was what happened across the country, where he would do like a concert. His followers would be here, hundreds of people, and they'd largely be unmasked. And so people who work in Skid Row, with many who are religious, they were very fearful because they have really had a strong presence, even before COVID, obviously. But once COVID hit, it was many religious people, organizations who really helped out with, in terms of providing meals, hand sanitizing stations, advocating for the people there, the residents of Skid Row, to wear masks. And they pretty much had a good hold of that community and keeping them safe. And if I recall correctly, there was never a huge outbreak coming out of Skid Row, and there was a big fear of that. So when they heard that Sean Feucht and what he represents, which his worship tour was to stand against COVID restrictions, because they saw it as religious persecution, because they couldn't gather in their houses of faith, they couldn't sing inside their churches. And so when the religious community here in Los Angeles, a group of pastors realized what he stood for, they said, no, they're not, he and his followers are not coming here. So they staged a blockade, a car rally to keep him and his followers out of the area. And they were largely successful. And the interesting thing is that they kind of saw this as protecting their flock from other Christians. So, you know, that night, a lot of the social media that I was seeing on New Year's Eve, because that's when the day he was supposed to come, it was this chant of, we don't need revival, Jesus is already here. And then, you know, January 6th happens. We saw the religious Christian symbolism of that day. That really alerted faith leaders who were Christian and of other faiths. And the same pastors, the same leaders who stood against Sean Feucht, organized a news conference after January 6th. And they started using this language of Christian nationalism. And they wanted city officials in Los Angeles to be held accountable because they didn't stop this demonstration. They had to stop it themselves. And a local pastor, who is, he's a religious leader, and he's also a big activist with the local Black Lives Matter LA chapter. He likened what happened here in Los Angeles with Sean Feucht to what happened in January 6th. And he described it as white supremacist violence and heretical Christian prophecy. And he was accompanied by many Christian leaders in that press conference. And so after that, after January 6th, you know, once the vaccine started becoming available, I did start seeing many anti-vaccine rallies, and one stands out in the summertime of 2021 in August. You explicitly saw Christian symbols. You saw Christ is King banners. One speaker who talked about the importance of embodying true conservatism, and that meant instilling Christian values back into our government. And so I hadn't really seen that before, and I'm not sure if they were emboldened by what happened January 6th, but that was very striking to see, and other people started taking note about that. And so I guess a few months later, faith leaders linked these two things. They linked what happened in New Year's Eve with Sean Foyt and January 6th. Like, they thought that these were two major events that they needed to denounce, and they needed to do it in a multi-faith capacity. And so I attended this multi-faith panel in a historically Black Christian church that included people who were Jewish, Muslim, Sikh, Hindu, and Indigenous. And they talked about Christian nationalism. And what was interesting is that a large part of that conversation is like, well, how do we define Christian nationalism? And a broad understanding, a broad definition that how they interpreted it as was, well, America is Christian and the government should keep it that way. That's the way they think of Christian nationalists, people who believe this. And so to them, defining it that way was important to know what they're fighting against, to know what they're up against. And their idea is that religious pluralism and interfaith work is what's necessary to try to combat this ideology.
Thank you, Alejandra. I would like to phrase question, and you can take it on and address it. Building on what you just said and the relative novelty of the terminology of Christian nationalism by the people who endorse it, I would like to look back and it's not just because, like Jack, you said that not a lot of the traditional religious establishment or figure mobilized. Religion is not the monopoly of religious figure. It is the right and responsibility of all American citizens. And if we look at the history of America, of course, it's a secular country in terms of institutional arrangement and status of religion in this vis-a-vis the state system and equality under the law. But at the same time, Christianity has been a continuous element of the national narrative. So if we talk about mobilizing Christian symbols and the terminology, this is not the monopoly of what we call today Christian nationalism. And of course, some of these more extremist Christian nationalists in American history have been very much intolerant and discriminatory and pro-slavery, but there have been also mobilization of Christian voices and groups against slavery. And we have also example in American history of progression of civil rights done by people who had a clear and open faith identity. So the question is, so was Martin Luther King a Christian nationalist? Were Abraham Lincoln a Christian nationalist? That's a question for all of you. Aren't we here at a time where we are only looking at a very particular trend? I'm not saying it didn't appear before in history, but it's particularly powerful today for two things. First, because they can rely on a very strong charismatic figure. And second, they have also invested different part of the state system with the goal to push toward the change of politics and law in favor of this intolerant, exclusive vision of the nation. But these two traits or features do not define all Christian nationalism. It seems to me that we are looking at a particular evangelical component and not all of them. And this, I would like to hear you, Terence, on that, because that's the work of someone like Anthea Butler, who has done a wonderful job at showing that what is now presented as a totality is actually an element among other threads of Christianity. So how would you call all these other people who have marked American history in a more positive and inclusive way, and that also declared themselves or presented themselves as nationalists? So the floor is yours. You can take up the questions, add other ideas. It's really your call.
I can take a first step, but I know that you mentioned Terence specifically. If Terence has
No, you too. I mentioned you too. So please go ahead.
Well, I mean, I think terms are hard, right? In the sense that there's not a uniform definition of conservative. There's not a uniform definition of liberal in this country either, right? And that there are divisions about that. But I will note that intersections of religion and politics are not the same thing as Christian nationalism. And other scholars have tried to make a distinction between, say, civil religion in the United States and iterations of Christian nationalism. And I think it's fair to say that there have been different Christian nationalisms throughout American history, right? Those who are claiming, for me, my operating definition is those who believe that the United States was founded as a Christian nation and that it either should remain as such or that has departed from that and needs to return to that Christian identity. And that I think that the second half of that sentence is even more important than the first. And so, I mean, I wrote a whole book about different religious groups that represent a very different vision for what they want America to be than Christian nationalists, people who fall more classically on the liberal or progressive side of the spectrum, who, and that tradition goes all the way back to the founding of the United States as well. But I don't think that many of those people were calling for an exclusivist vision for what that Christianity looks like, right? I mean, if the United States history is evidential of anything, there's actually been a lot of dispute among Christians throughout its history. I mean, when after the Puritans landed here, within a generation, they were hanging Quakers in the streets for worshiping differently from them, not to mention their way that they treated indigenous people in this country who obviously have their own spiritual traditions. And so, the way I look at it is that I don't think Christian nationalism is necessarily denying that at all. In fact, some of the most fierce critics of Christian nationalism are other religious voices. For instance, the Poor People's Campaign run by Reverend William Barber, one of their main tenets is that they oppose religious nationalism and have been deeply critical of the people who participate in the insurrection or those who invoke faith to take similar actions. I think covering them is equally as important as covering this sub-community. But I do think these are folks who, by and large, often claim to want to envision America as a Christian nation. And I'm actually sensitive to the argument as well that nativism might be a better way to describe a lot of these movements, particularly those in the more extreme right. But I do think they're looking at this contemporary iteration of Christian nationalism that terms, while they are often imperfect, are helping. They help the reader kind of organize in their thoughts who these people are and what they are calling for. I know that Terence was speaking about this as well, so I defer to him about how there are also these alternative visions for how to be, perhaps patriotic, or a vision for America that is inherently less exclusivist. But I'll defer to him to answer that part.
No, thanks, Jocelyne. That's a great question you raised. And I think in terms of the U.S. context, right, in some respects, it really boils down to sort of this Manichaean divide in terms of the white-black binary, right, and how you name any immigrant group, and they've all had to sort of go through this litmus test in terms of, can you perform whiteness in public spaces, right, to qualify as a citizen. And so I think that takes on a particular kind of role in terms of shaping religious dialogue, but also in terms of sort of Christian nationalism. And also, I think what's also interesting is that if we look at sort of Reconstruction, right, we look at the Cold War, we look at sort of the Civil Rights Movement, there are different iterations in which people are appealing to whatever you want to call it, either anti-Black racism, this idea of the moral problem of Blackness, that there's something about the iteration of this radical other, right, that people are appealing to both, right, in terms of the Reconstruction amendments, in terms of trying to advance certain rights, but also in terms of major cases like Plessy versus Ferguson, really trying to deny and maintain separate but equal. But there's something that's happening both in the legal sort of world, as well as in our sort of culture, as well as also in our religious spaces, that's sort of appealing to, right, science, law, culture to affirm this anti-Blackness. And we see this happening in this iteration of Christian nationalism. And what to call that, I don't know, but I do think there's something very universal in terms of when there's a moment of trying to sort of reify a certain kind of patriotism that we often find as other, right, to stand upon and to condemn, to bury and to try to kill. So I think that's an important point I want to kind of keep on the table. And then also in terms of, thinking about, say, folks like, whether it's Ella Baker or Martin Luther King Jr. or even a Malcolm X, I do think they navigated religion in very different ways, right? For Malcolm X, it's about this idea of self-love, because the African Americans have been told you are sort of the absence of any humanity, right? And for King, it was about using sort of Black Christian prophetic preaching as a way to hold the country morally accountable, right, for the sins of enslavement. And for someone like Ella Baker, it was this whole idea of how do you galvanize sort of the best of your tradition to make this ethical turn, where this ethical turn has everything to do with, right, fighting for the least off, right, ensuring that those at the very bottom are given access and given the very conditions they need, right, to have all the resources. And so I do think religion is operating differently, but I think what seems to link both the King X as well as Ella Baker, right, is again this appeal toward expanding the very possibilities, right, of human flourishing based on moral commitments, right, this moral commitment to ensuring that all humans, right, have this right and this freedom, right, that's protected both legally but also culturally. And I think in our country, we've had a very difficult time protecting, particularly African Americans, culturally, right, because culturally, whites and others can just randomly kill Black and brown people, and usually without any punishment. So I think I want to keep those things on the table as we're thinking about iterations of Christian nationalism.
Thank you. Alejandra?
Yeah, I mean, during the pandemic, which we're still in, and during the racial justice protest after George Floyd was killed by police, I did see different iterations of how faith communities were involved. And one thing that I really did notice is that right here in Los Angeles, Black Lives Matter, the local chapter here, they held some really huge rallies, and they were not one of the main leaders. He is a Christian leader, but he led Black Lives Matter demonstrations, not in this religious way. He happened to be religious, but he was one of the main people who spearheaded this, one of the most attended Black Lives Matters rally that early on in like the summertime, but it was not explicitly religious. And so what I did notice during those demonstrations is that the pastors, clergy who were in these demonstrations, they kind of take a step back and they left largely Black women who are spiritual or secular to lead these movements. And I also saw a divide in the way that some religious communities chose to advocate against police brutality and for defunding local police departments. There were some religious communities that were very much criticized for working with the Los Angeles Police Department, for asking them to take a kneel, and they kind of saw them as linking with the enemy. And so there were different ways that religious communities were involved during George Floyd, but they were very much there, and they let, you know, the spiritual secular leaders lead the way, as opposed to what we saw in the 60s. But in terms of defining Christian nationalism, I, you know, I did see a lot the role that churches played here in advocating for the vaccine in working class communities specifically, because Latinos, Black community residents were left behind, and the churches really took a role in getting the vaccine in their communities. And so, I mean, that's a way of fulfilling their faith by partnering with government officials, by partnering with public health officials in getting the medicine to the hands where they need it the most. And so, but they see Christian nationalism not as what they're embodying, but they do see it as a definition of, you know, America is a Christian nation, and the government needs to do the best to keep it that way. And so that's the way they see it. They don't see what they're doing to better the community as a form of Christian nationalism. And so, so I did see a lot of that happening. And what really stood out to me with Sean Foyt was that Christians, mostly of color, who were protecting the Skid Row community, they were protecting them from a certain kind of Christian. And so that was very eye-opening to me.
Now, Alejandra, I think what's also interesting about your point you made in terms of, you know, BLM started with a love letter, right? A love letter, this whole idea of Black Lives Matter, but also the love letter in terms of acknowledging Black love and also this acknowledgement of healing. And I do think it's interesting that when we look particularly in the 60s, that a number of the Black women who were involved in terms of, you know, sort of, you know, writing letters, or people who were actually managing organizations that in some cases the men were the sort of the figurehead, that they weren't necessarily Christian, as you said, right? And yet they embodied a certain kind of sort of ethical commitment, right? That pushed them, and that I think fueled the people. And we often don't hear those stories. And I'm wondering have you noticed that in terms of outside of African-American communities, you know, women, when they are involved who are maybe not as Christian or have a particular political agenda, where they're actually able to have a far more kind of inclusive project. And it's interesting because for the Black women in the 60s and for BLM, it wasn't about an exclusionary moment, right? It was this idea that when you start with your very center as a way to open up, right? You don't start with the center to then to close in. So I think it's a very interesting way to think about it in terms of what happens when women who are conscious of this sort of democratic possibility, conscious of this kind of very broad and inclusive ethic, how does that change the political narrative?
Yeah, Alejandra, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I mean, Patrice Cullors, who's one of the lead Black Lives Matter organizers here in Los Angeles, she's been attacked by the Christian right because they call the Black Lives Matter an anti-Christian movement. And, you know, she's really, she's had to denounce that, because what she's saying is like, look, she has called the Black Lives Matter movement a spiritual movement, and the leaders of Black Lives Matter, they really in touch with African spirituality. But she does make sure to highlight that we lead a movement with with people of different faiths. And so she does make sure to note that. And when I've been at rallies, at protests, there are many Christians there. There are a range of faiths. There's atheists groups who make known that they're atheists, and they organize in churches, in church spaces. And so the organization of these rallies and demonstrations, even though it's led by spiritual secular leaders, a lot of the organizing takes place in churches, and they're inclusive of clergy. I mean, there's clergy for Black lives here. And so they are inclusive of different faiths, and they know that people of faith are a strong force in their movement.
So it seems the more I listen to the three of you, that you are all in agreement that there is a positive role for religion in American national politics. But what is specific to this movement is something that doesn't come up very much in the way we analyze it, is the victimhood. This version of Christian narrative is not about pride or exceptionalism, instead revert, like we are victim. And this is, in my opinion, something we are not paying attention enough. And second, it's not the morality, as you have all said. Morality is part of American political history since its inception. It is about a deliberate, unprecedented political work, legislation, procedure. You have tons of people who are proud to be American, who do politics in the name of America, that mobilize, but I have not seen this same systematic attack. Trump administration, we have to be very clear on that. It's not just word or saying make America great again. It is about changing legislation on sexual minority, on women's rights, on racial and ethnic minorities. I mean, the rights have shrunken. And this is not happening. For example, I look at other form of use of Christianity in Europe. Lots of people are very happy to say Europe is Christian. They would not be very happy with what Trump has done with the support of some of this group on the political system. And that's why I'm saying the more we culture and nature this idea that this is Christian nationalism, it is taking the part for the whole, and it is actually not addressing the real issue of erosion of democracy in which we are now. And it is also putting on the margin a lot of this mobilization that you just described. They may not be done under the banner of a particular denomination, but they involve a lot of religiously motivated or morally motivated people. So I am a little concerned actually by this agreement that this is Christian nationalism and that's all there is to it. Right? You may have.
I mean, if I'm hearing you correctly, just so I understand, you're critical of the fact that it's called Christian nationalism and that arguably gives this group what they want, that they get to own the term Christian.
Yeah.
Is I'm hearing that as a
because Jack, before January 6th, during even the whole campaign of Trump, so make America again, they were even called neo-nationalists. I don't have any issue with that. They could be called nativist, but the moment they own these two terms together, it is politically dangerous for exclusion of tons of other groups and also redefinition of American history. Since when is it victim, the victimhood? You know, I come from Europe. Under the victimhood, the Nazi came to power. That was the motivation. We have to regain our strengths and our power over Europe. So this is beyond Christianity. And the more we focus only on the Christian component, the less we pay attention to this other dimension. That's what I was trying to say.
And what if they're working hand in hand though, Jocelyne, in terms of when you think about even Barack Obama, he never received the majority of educated white women voters, right? And what is it about Trump that then galvanizes both white women, but also white Christians and white Christian evangelicals? And if they're working hand in hand, I think we have to name it as a particular kind of Christian nationalism, especially if they are the fuel and that's the base to whom Trump is appealing. And that's the base that's turned to him to say, look, we think you can actually get our people on the Supreme Court. And some people I've read articles that have said, look, sometimes God uses the devil for good purposes. And so there are a number of white evangelical Christians who think God is using Trump despite whatever they may think of his morality or his positionality.
So we have 15 minutes left. I'm going to take on some of the questions here. There are two that seems to me directly connected to our debate. The issue is not Christianity in general, from Melvin. male, but the Eurocentric evangelical manifest destiny sect of Americans that are trying to change racism into a cultural religious struggle for national control. And the second one actually talked directly to what I was trying to say. The new, from Marco Ferrario, the new anti-abortion ruling, how well is it connected with the religious movement? What is the relation between the religious identity and civil rights? Okay, so the floor is yours.
No, and those are great questions. And I think, again, depending on where you're reading, and I try to read widely, there's momentum, at least among, a huge segment of Christianity, both Catholics and Protestant, right, who have been pushing for quite some time that Roe versus Wade should be abandoned, right, and demolished. And so the question is, how do we name that? And can we name that without demonizing folks? And how do we sit with it, right? That there are religious differences over abortion. So I think that's very clear. And it's very clear that they're working hand in hand with very smart legal scholars and with politicians, as you say. So they've been working, little by little, right? As folk have been hitting the street, they've actually been working in state legislatures, right, to ensure that this moment could happen in terms of both at the state and federal level. And so the question is it all of Christianity? Maybe not, but there's something very distinct about American exceptionalism, this idea that we're sitting on a hill, that we patrol sort of the world, that has everything to do with a certain identity in America. Now, what's interesting, though, is that I think with the rise of Trump, there was this notion that maybe we should actually turn inward. Maybe we shouldn't police the world, which I think is also very different gives it a different kind of sort of direction. And yet it's still motivated by a lot of Christian symbols and a lot of folk who are claiming, right, the Bible as their source and their fuel for their political motivation. So I think it's a dangerous sort of collision, but I think we have to name it, that it's there, and which is why I'm not sure, even for good reasons, religion is helpful in public spaces, because the question is, well, do I demonize my Catholic and Protestant brothers and sisters who are against, abortion? How do I sit with that? And how do I sit with them who condemn Christian nationalism, but yet they still support ending Roe versus Wade? So that tension, I think, is something that I want to expose. And so now I'm at the point where I'm not sure religion is even helpful, right? Because it creates such a collision and creates so much death.
Yes. Jack, you want to address some of these questions?
Yeah, and I know Alejandra's done some reporting and some stuff I'm about to talk about too. I went down to the Supreme Court this week after the draft opinion was leaked. And what was interesting is that I was there about midday. In the end of the day, there was just a mass of people, primarily people in support of abortion rights, almost overwhelmingly, really. But there was a period around midday where it was still mostly people who were there in support of abortion rights, but they had kind of sectioned off the front of the Supreme Court. It looked very similar to how it did back in December when they had the oral arguments, where one section was kind of for those who are taking an anti-abortion stance, and one that was for supporters of abortion rights. And there was deep religious representation on both, which is more visible than, there's a long history of religious advocates for abortion rights, but they aren't always as visible in these spaces. And Catholics for Choice, for instance, was very visible and represented there. They were one of the leader of that was one of the first to speak, and the rally that happened around midday, right after they spoke, there was the head of the National Council on Jewish Women, who argue theologically that they have a different posture on abortion altogether within the Jewish tradition. And what was interesting is on the other side, which by that point had been relatively abandoned, there was two very visible figures who were there, kind of celebrating this dynamic of this leaked opinion. And one of them was a person who was blowing a shofar and holding a Bible. And when I spoke with him, he had actually come as part of the truckers' convoy to Washington, D.C., which is in opposition to vaccine mandates, and where Christian nationalism was deeply expressed. And he had never left. And he said to me that his faith compelled him to be there. Within a few minutes, standing next to him was another individual who just had a giant sign that just said "One Nation Under God." And he quoted, Psalms for saying why he was also opposed to abortion. And then around them was a group of, or nearby a group praying was a group of parents from a small Christian school in Oklahoma. He said that they were there by happenstance, but they were there to pray and celebrate this draft opinion. So I bring all that up because the anti-abortion movement is broad. There's a lot of things going on in that. But figures who belong to or who visibly represent what we've kind of talked about as a modern iteration of Christian nationalism were actually very present that day. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to kind of recognize that as a part of this broader movement in order to fully understand it, right? Like, I don't think Trumpism or even the anti-abortion movement is only Christian nationalism, but I don't think you can understand Trumpism or the anti-abortion movement without understanding Christian nationalism. So, and again, there's been a lot of other reporting on that too, but I just think that religious element, to Terrence's point, whether or not it does something good or not, it is there in force right now in terms of, and it looks like it's only going to get louder in the months to come.
So there are two other questions. One about what was Christian, it's Martha, what was Christian about the founding father who took power in this new nation? They were white male landowners who excluded everyone else. So that's not exactly Christ's message. And when was this ever a Christian nation? End of quotation. And George, there seemed to be a significant Catholic presence during the January 6th insurrection. Can you address the Catholic role in white Christian nationalism? So who wants to take those? I can go ahead, John.
I can at least speak to the Catholic part,
Okay.
which is just because I've done some reporting on it recently. The America First group that I was mentioning earlier, who chant Christ is King when they gather, at least the leader identifies as Catholic very boldly and proudly. And often when they are gathering, they're holding up crucifixes, symbols more often associated with Catholicism. And, we often discuss white evangelicals in particular as disproportionately represented among Christian nationalist circles, events, that sort of thing. But there is a Catholic presence, and it much to the chagrin of other Catholics, I should note, who vehemently disagree with a lot of the postures that they tend to take. But there's really extreme versions of this that I only learned about recently from extremism scholars who refer to like clerical fascism, a very particular kind of Catholic extremism. But more often, I think Terence was speaking recently about how immigrant populations sometimes go through this sort of process in America. And I think what is interesting is that another Christian nationalist movement would have been the Ku Klux Klan. He had a very specific, narrow vision for what America should be that was white supremacist. And people that they might have subjugated, including Catholics, are also some of the folks now who are championing a Christian nationalist narrative that is, a little broader in the sense that it doesn't exclude Catholics, but do seem to like take up that charge. And, that you can argue that Steve Bannon, as a component of Trumpism, was a part of this. He had a Catholic identity as well, that there is a whole right-wing Catholic element here. But it's interesting to pin down in terms of, where does that community end and where does the white evangelical part begin? But I do think it's an interesting point of journalistic inquiry moving forward.
Okay, Terence, you want to say something?
Sure, I want to make sure we don't leave Alejandra out as well, but I just want to say in terms of the interesting piece in terms of, when we think about, this legislation and thinking through sort of political matters, I do think we can't leave the question in terms of the jurists on the Supreme Court, in terms of we've had a very sort of, let's say, very particular set of religious representation, primarily, Catholic and Jewish, right, representation, a few Protestants. And so we've got to think about that also in terms of the weight of this decision and the weight of other decisions. And also, I think because of the undue influence, say, of Catholicism and Protestantism, that they do carry a different kind of burden that we as Americans should hold them responsible in terms of ensuring us, right, that their private commitments aren't influencing the direction of these decisions. And in terms of the whole founding piece, I mean, we're very clear that, right, separation of church and state was clearly at the kind of very root of this foundation. And yet clearly there was leakage. There's always leakage, right? And again, we're not condemning Christianity. We're condemning the ways in which it's used, right, to kill people and to stratify, right, and to delimit.
Alejandra?
Yeah, and I guess in talking about abortion rights, I think many Christian religious people are coming to terms that they have created or helped to create this a stigma around our sexualities and reproductive lives. And I am seeing more religious people trying to undo that. And one person that comes to mind is the Reverend Angela Williams, who she's a lead organizer for this group called Spiritual Alliance of Communities for Reproductive Dignity. So what they're doing is they created this curriculum to have congregations declare that they are reproductive freedom congregations, just like churches affirm LGBT rights, they affirm the rights to reproductive justice and care. And she works with Christians, religious figures from different faiths in blue and red states to declare that their congregations believe this. And so we are seeing more of that. And in the wake of this leak, I spoke with the Reverend Daniel Cantor in Texas, who after the restrictive abortion law in Texas there, he has been helping spearhead chaplains to accompany pregnant people access abortion care in other states. And so what he's saying is that, if Roe is overturned, that he thinks there will be a rise in progressive faith communities denouncing Roe being overturned and helping people access abortion.
A question that goes back to the visibility of this more inclusive form of Christianity. From Anna, what Christian leaders or churches today are working specifically to protect democracy? That is, what Christian leaders are working directly to confront white Christian nationalism. This community is not as loud as those on the right. Why is that? Is it weakness, funding, denial, etc.? So if you can address that. I am also saying maybe it's because we are not turning our light on them, maybe not. That's my own. So the floor is yours. Alejandra, you want to say something on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think back to, I interviewed a range of faith leaders who are working to combat this ideology. And, before interviewing them and before attending this multi-faith panel denouncing Christian nationalism, I hadn't seen faith leaders from minority communities, working class communities really explicitly denounce Christian nationalism until after January 6th. And so that has been my role in this Pulitzer Center series on Christian nationalism, is to explore how other faiths are working to combat this. And this was one first step that I saw in terms of people who are Muslim, Sikh, Hindu, of indigenous background, gathering together to talk about, well, what is Christian nationalism and how do we address it in our congregations? The only thing is that these are progressive spaces, so I don't know if they're just preaching to the choir. And so, but I guess by example, they want to show that this is what religious pluralism looks like. And we denounce Christian nationalism, we're talking about it, and we're addressing it in our congregations. So to me, that was a step, and in amplifying that these voices are out there.
Okay, and he has a take on that. I mean, just quickly, I think you can look at the Senate, look at Senators Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff. I mean, that's sort of a multi-religious sort of coalition to combat right? Voting rights restrictions, right? Thinking through legislatively, how do we work together as a team? And in Georgia alone, there are a number of Jewish women's groups that are also working with African-American women to deal with voting rights legislation in Georgia. So I think that's one example. But again, as you mentioned, right, I don't think we would shed light on these folks because I'm not sure that sells, right? Talking about Trump sells on media.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, what has been particularly interesting in the last couple of years is that Black Protestant leaders in particular, right? Like down in Georgia, they had AME leaders who threatened to boycott major companies unless they endorsed voting rights bills, and that got relatively little attention compared to how much attention is paid to Christian nationalist leaders, for instance. Never mind that last year, the Poor People's Campaign, led by Reverend William Barber, actually had one of the largest mass arrest demonstrations in American history, like a peaceful protest on Capitol Hill. And there just wasn't that much press there, right? Like they were there to protest, particularly Joe Manchin, calling not only for a $15 an hour minimum wage, but also for voting rights and for eliminating the filibuster in order to secure those voting rights. Here in DC, we've had faith leaders rally for DC statehood, again, framed as a way to ensure a expanding of democratic votes. And these leaders are really vocal, including, Reverend Senator Warnock. You never remember if it's Reverend Senator, Senator Reverend Warnock is a big part of this conversation. He was a big part of the legislation that was being introduced in the actual Senate. So there's a direct through line here for communities and a group of communities that have been very vocal, very active, and when it comes to actually protesting on the ground, some of the most visible activists for voting rights, full stop, irrespective of whether it's religious or secular, in the last year and a half. They just didn't get paid as much attention to because, to Terrence's point, it doesn't sell as well. But there's no shortage of faith communities that have been, in addition to pushing back against Christian nationalism, there's a group, Christians Against Christian Nationalism, what have you. But when it comes to like securing voting rights and expanding voting rights and protecting the right to vote and expanding the map in terms of statehood, faith groups and faith leaders are very well represented in that movement, arguably leading it, but just don't get the same level of attention.
Yeah, so we have arrived at the end of our time, unfortunately. So I apologize to all the questions that could not be addressed directly. They will be sent to the panelists and they can address them and respond at their leisure. The goal was really to focus on this question of what is Christian nationalism today in the US, and the organizers will collect all the questions and send them to us for further responses or clarification. So this is the end of this hour, and of course an hour was certainly not enough. I would like to thank Alejandra, Jack, and Terence for their lively contribution, and thank you, dear audience, for being with us for this whole hour, and see you soon, maybe in another Berkeley Center seminar. Bye-bye now.